Okay. All right. So we are going to get started. And so I'm glad the two of you were able to join, and I know others will watch this later. If people do have questions, they can always add in the comments questions and we can try to address them later. And then as we go along, if either of you have questions, just chime in. But we're going to do the chapter 1 review for Abolition of Man and just kind of summarize the chapter, walk through the chapter a little bit just to kind of help people, making sure people understand where C.S. Lewis is going. His first chapter is going to set the stage for chapters 2 and 3. All right, well, but before we begin, let's begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Oh God, our Heavenly Father, thank you for the many blessings and gifts you've given us this day and every day. We ask for your forgiveness for all the ways that we've fallen short and for all the ways we failed to give you glory in our life. We ask for all the different intentions on our hearts, particularly for all those who are suffering, who feel like they are in despair or hopeless. Hopefully they will find hope in you. We ask for an increase in your grace that we can be more loving, more merciful, more compassionate, and more selfless throughout our life. And we prayed together, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right, can y'all see that? It just kind of says chapter 1.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to kind of walk through this, taking a couple pages at a time, summarize some of the key points that stood out to me to help people walk through this a little bit. So at the beginning of chapter 1, one of the first things that C.S. Lewis points out, just the very beginning, the first few sentences, is that he's letting us know that part of the point of this lecture series that became this book is the importance of education. And so he is going to emphasize children because he's going to be referring to this book that was given to this upper age group, so kind of high school age group, but it's also education for us as well. So the point of the book is the importance of education for children and us. And I think a lot of it is he's going to want us to ask ourselves, you know, how are we educating ourselves? What books do we read? Who do we listen to? What do we listen to? How do we gain knowledge and information? Are we aware of the sources and potential biases of the resources that we're using? Are we thinking critically? Do we recognize that there are facts and truths? And then are we distinguishing those from opinions and preferences? Can we identify when there's an attempt to persuade us using propaganda versus when there is an actual effort to propagate truth to us? Are we appropriately open-minded? This will come out a little bit throughout the book a little later, kind of what he means by that. Are we appropriately open-minded? Not just accepting anything and everything, but being open to correction, being very critical, making sure we're thinking logically and reasonably. How do we view reality, and how does this impact our learning? And then are we educating others effectively? These and many other things, I think, are going to be some of the questions that C.S. Lewis would want us to ask when it comes to thinking about how we're educated and how we educate others. So that kind of comes out in the first few sentences of the chapter. And then he's going to mention this green book. And in the introduction video that I did, I mentioned this briefly, but the green book is this book that C.S. Lewis was sent to review. It really existed back in the early 1900s when he wrote, or when he did this lecture series. And the green book, he just gives it this fake name because he doesn't want to distract his readers from the actual name. But we do know in reality, the book was called The Control of Language, and it was by these authors who he's going to nickname Gaius Antidius, just because he does not want to, again, distract from his purpose. He is being critical of the actual book and of the actual authors, but he doesn't want to criticize them directly. So he gives us this alternate name of the book and the authors, just so that he can let us know there is a real book, but he doesn't want to distract us by telling us who it is. But this was a book, it was an English textbook for upper school, and he was sent this advanced copy to read it and to review it. And the purpose of this English textbook for the students was to help them have a critical approach to reading and writing. That's what the book's intentions were. And so C.S. Lewis gets this book, he reads it, and he's shocked because he feels like that the authors do more than what the book is intended to do. He feels like that they are sharing ideas and worldview, and that it kind of permeates this book, and that the students reading the book are not just simply learning how to critically approach reading and writing, that they're learning this underlying subjective worldview, and he's very concerned about that. And so he introduces us to that book. And then right at the beginning, in my book, it's pages 2 and 3. I think it's pretty similar, regardless of which version you have. But at the very beginning of chapter 1 is this very crucial scene that helps introduce C.S. Lewis's main purpose of this book. And there's this account of this man Coleridge at the waterfall. And Coleridge is standing at the waterfall. And this is an actual event that people knew about in England at the time. And C.S. Lewis is mentioning how the Green Book refers to this event, where there's this man named Coleridge. He's there at the waterfall with these tourists. And one tourist says, "Oh, the waterfall is sublime." Another tourist says the waterfall is pretty. And then Coleridge judges the first tourist to be right and the second to be inaccurate. Coleridge agrees the waterfall is sublime, and he feels like pretty is not an accurate description of the waterfall. And so the Green Book then takes this scene to say that, well, whenever the tourist and Coleridge say that this waterfall is sublime, they're just merely revealing their feelings. They're just essentially saying not that the waterfall is actually sublime, but that the person has sublime feelings. And so what the authors of the Green Book are doing, which upsets C.S. Lewis, is that these they're saying that these statements about the waterfall being sublime is merely a subjective value statement. And the authors of the Green Book are suggesting these personal feelings do not correspond to anything subjective. They're just merely subjective. And there's almost this underlying suggestion also that Coleridge really should not reject the second tourist view that the waterfall is pretty, because this is all subjective. It could be pretty to one person and sublime to another. Neither one is right. Neither one of them is wrong. They both are correct in expressing their own personal subjective feelings and preferences to this waterfall. There's nothing objective about the waterfall that should merit any particular response. A person can have whatever response they want, is what the authors of the Green Book are trying to teach their students who are reading it. And they're also kind of suggesting that these subjective feelings aren't really saying anything important about the waterfall itself. And so C.S. Lewis is going to be very critical of this, and this is really going to be throughout the Abolition of Man, but in this particular scene of the waterfall, he's very critical of what the Green Book authors are doing. And he says, first of all, they're being very inconsistent, because they're saying that when the tourist says the waterfall is sublime, that this is merely saying, I have sublime feelings. But instead, Lewis says that the object, like the waterfall, is actually causing feelings of veneration or humility, and so then it makes the object itself sublime. So it can't just be that we're projecting our feelings. There is something about the object that is objectively meriting a proper response, which is veneration, reverence, humility. And then that's what leads the viewer, the observer of the waterfall, to say, wow, that's sublime. And so C.S. Lewis says the idea that someone is just projecting their feelings is very inconsistent. And he uses another example. C.S. Lewis uses the example of, if I meet a person and I tell the person, you are contemptible, then the authors of the Green Book are suggesting that this would be just simply be saying, I have contemptible feelings. I have despicable feelings or reprehensible feelings. And then C.S. Lewis says, is this what we mean when we say you are contemptible? Not at all. We actually mean that we believe the person is being contemptible, is acting contemptible. They're being despicable or reprehensible in some way. It's not merely a projection of my feelings. There's something that that person's doing objectively that I hold to be contemptible. And so he's saying that this is really an inconsistent notion, that when we express certain descriptions of objects or people, that it's always just merely projecting feelings. That can't be the case. That's always something subjective. And so C.S. Lewis says that whether it's intentional or not, the Green Book is influencing its readers to hold that anytime they see a statement of value, like something's contemptible or something's sublime, that these are merely subjective and they're merely expressing one's personal feelings. There's nothing objectable, there's nothing objective about the object that merits any particular response. And so then on page 6, C.S. Lewis will kind of use another example beyond the waterfall to express this same idea. He says that in the Green Book, one of the other things they do is they show this ad for a pleasure cruise to the readers, to the students reading the book. And the pleasure cruise talks about all these great adventures and these great things someone could see. And C.S. Lewis says that the intention of this book, on the face of it, is supposed to be teaching these students about reading and writing, and how to be critical of reading and writing, and how to improve their skills. And he says that if this book was doing its job of trying to teach grammar and good writing skills, then it should have compared this pleasure cruise ad to maybe a great adventure novel to demonstrate how to express emotions well in writing. But instead, what the Green Book does is it shows this ad for a pleasure cruise, and then it just basically says, well, no, this pleasure cruise is false. The emotions it's creating within you are false, because what they're describing is not really going to happen. You're not really going to have these great adventures that they are suggesting, that they're trying to kind of engender through these pictures. These emotions they're trying to create within you are false. That's really not what's going to happen to you. And so C.S. Lewis says that instead of teaching the students how to cultivate proper emotions to a situation, the book seems to be teaching these students that these emotions aroused by this pleasure cruise ad do not correlate with reality. So these are subjective. And he's kind of essentially saying, don't get duped by these ads. When things create emotions within you, don't get fooled to thinking that there's something objectively true. It's all subjective. It's all based on opinions and preferences. And because this ad created these emotions within you, don't believe them. And then he's going to move on to use that example to use examples of patriotism. And he's going to say, sometimes you may see ads for patriotism, trying to encourage someone to be patriotic. And then he's going to, on page 9, talk about one of the problems with this Green Book, saying that there's this patriotic ad, and to say that it's misleading by trying to create these emotions within you, because patriotism, if someone feels that patriotism is good, that's simply subjective. That's one's preferences, that patriotism is good, or that selflessness and sacrifice are good. The book's trying to create this notion that patriotism is simply a subjective value. And then C.S. Lewis is going to say, well, if there is a false or misleading advertisement for patriotism, then who will it influence? And C.S. Lewis is going to say there's two types of people it will not influence. There's those above it and those below it. And what C.S. Lewis will explain is that those who are above it, meaning it means that if you have an ad for patriotism, trying to encourage people to be patriotic, trying to show people patriotism is a good thing. If a person is already courageous and already honorable and noble, they already have this patriotic spirit about them, they're not going to need an ad to encourage this virtue within them. They're already going to have these ordered emotions that have been cultivated. And so this ad is not going to affect that person one way or the other, because their emotions are already properly, rightly ordered to the good of patriotism and honor and sacrifice and selflessness. And so if an ad is misleading, it won't affect these people. They'll just blow it off or just dismiss it and recognize this ad is false. Then there's another group of people who, if you have an ad for patriotism that's misleading, C.S. Lewis says, if you're below it. And what he means by this is that there's a group of people who are just completely cowards. They have this vice of cowardiceness. They have never cultivated the virtue of courage. And so they are cowards. They will not be influenced by this ad for patriotism because they lack the virtue of courage. And this ad is not going to create courage within them. So they're going to ignore the ad regardless of what it's saying. So if you have a misleading ad, if you're above it because you already have the virtue, or you're below it because you lack it, that ad's not going to create something that you lack. Neither of these groups are going to be influenced by this misleading advertisement. And so he says C.S. Lewis wants us to recognize there's two people who will not be influenced by propaganda. And it's these two groups. But there's this middle group is who he's the most worried about, because the people we're trying to educate and trying to teach and trying to cultivate virtue and trying to cultivate rightly ordered emotions, which is most people, they are going to be affected by an ad. If it's misleading, if it's propaganda, they'll be affected by it. And so he says, but what it seems like the Green Book is trying to do is just to tell people all emotion is just subjective, dismiss all emotion. And that's, C.S. Lewis says, that's not exactly the approach that we should be taking when trying to educate children and trying to, or even ourselves, and trying to help us to become protected from propaganda. It's not just to tell us that all emotion is subjective or all emotion is wrong, or to tell us that we should not have emotion at all. And then he gives one final example of this problem. And that in another book, this is in Abolition of Man, page 10 to 11, they talk about horses. And he says that in the book, horses are praised as being the willing servants of early colonists in Australia. And he says that, but what happens is that rather than compare this book that praises horses as being willing servants of the early colonists, or rather than comparing that to other literature that also talks about horses, maybe other literature that talks about the role that horses have played in human history, or books that talk about man's relationship with horses, then what happens is this little book just says that horses are not interested in colonial expansion. It just says horses are just horses. Any praise given to them is just subjective. That's a personal preference. The book discounts any real value the horses have. And so rather than saying horses are worthy of praise, they merit praise, or maybe explaining why there's been some issues, rather than explaining anything objective about the value of horses, the book just says, no, horses are just horses. Any value given to them is merely subjective. And so C.S. Lewis is going to say that in doing this, what the readers learn to do is dismiss all emotion towards horses as unreasonable, because they don't correlate with any objective reality. The readers are being taught to say that any emotion that you have towards the horses and the role they played in history is a personal preference, it's subjective, there's nothing merited by the horses in any objective way. Just dismiss all emotion. So C.S. Lewis is saying that's essentially what's being done by creating this subjective emphasis. And C.S. Lewis says the problem is this approach is not, it's not going to influence those people who really know and really love horses. Just like he was talking about with patriotism, the people who already have that virtue are not going to be persuaded to dismiss any value horses have. People who really know and love horses know the value horses have, that it's objective, that horses do merit some objective value, they do merit some praise. And so C.S. Lewis says these type of people already have learned rightly ordered emotions towards horses. They're not going to be swayed by this propaganda that horses have no value and that any emotion is subjective. The book is also not going to influence people who merely see horses as just old-fashioned forms of transportation and who are obstinate to hearing otherwise. So people who are completely closed-minded, obstinate, will not be influenced by this little book, and the people who know and love horses will not be influenced, but a lot of other people might be influenced by this approach of just strictly saying any emotion that you have reading about these horses helping the early colonists, that emotion is subjective and should be dismissed. And he says it's not going to teach readers the value of horses. It means that people are going to be taught that horses have no value. Any emotion they create within you is subjective. You should dismiss it as being anything objective. You should dismiss it as being personal opinion. And he says that there's a danger with this, because then people are going to be less likely to enjoy horses if they have them. There's also a danger that people could abuse horses or be cruel to them because they've now dismissed that there's any merit to them, that there's any objective value to them. And so he uses this example of horses to try to help us see the problem with subjectivity and the problem with the fact that by creating this notion that we should eliminate all emotion, or that we should see all emotion as subjective, that there's nothing objective, is dangerous, because it can create, in this example, cruelty or abuse to horses because we see no value in them, or it can create this lack of appreciation, this lack of enjoyment of them, kind of this just empty desert of emotions. And that's a problem. But we can expand this not just to horses, but to anything. Anything that these authors of the Green Book are trying to discuss, like even the waterfall, as if there's nothing objective about it, that there's nothing the waterfall merits, there's no proper response. So for example, if you look at this picture of the waterfall, what C.S. Lewis is going to argue is that this should merit an appropriate response from us, and that appropriate response should be something along the lines of, this is awe-inspiring, this is majestic, this is glorious, this is sublime, like Coleridge would have said. This is moving, it's delightful. There's just something incredible and amazing when you stand before a waterfall like this, and that's an appropriate response. It's not something that's merely subjective. It's not just my subjective feeling that this is sublime or glorious or majestic or awe-inspiring. This waterfall merits a proper response. And what he's going to say is this subjectivism is dangerous, because what it's trying to teach the readers of the Green Book is that if you see a waterfall like this, you should dismiss any emotion as being merely subjective. That really you can just stand before this waterfall and it'd be okay to say, yeah, that's ugly, or, oh yeah, that's no big deal, or whatever. That'd be an appropriate response because it's all subjective. And C.S. Lewis is going to say, no, this waterfall merits a proper emotional response, and we should train our students to have a proper response. Now, there can be some subjectivity to it. There may be some waterfalls that one person likes better than another, but there's still this objective element where this waterfall merits a response. Similarly, if you look at like the night sky, there's something objective here. There's a proper response that this should elucidate within us. There should be this sense of awe, of grandeur, maybe even thinking there's something bigger than me out there. There's something transcendent, there's something divine, there's something heavenly. This should make us have a proper emotion. It's not just simply subjective, and it's not just simply personal preference here. C.S. Lewis is going to say that this vision of the heavens at night, the sky at night, there is a rightly ordered response that we should be cultivating within ourselves and within others.
Hey, Alice, I have a question back to the waterfall. Okay, so yeah, you know, most people would see that as being beautiful and stuff. Okay, but now wouldn't it be true though that, let's say, if I had had a bad experience and lost a loved one at a waterfall or something like that, then my view of that would not be beautiful. It would be changed, altered because of a negative experience I had in relation to the waterfall?
My first thought responding to that would be, I think you would still recognize some type of objective grandeur about it. And
okay, all right.
There is something still majestic here. You still may have a negative emotion because of the bad experience.
Okay.
I think you could still step back from that and recognize, yeah, there's something powerful with this waterfall. There's something grand about it. But yeah, I have this personal, that's whenever you have that subjective element, the subjective dimension that comes into play that makes me maybe fearful or sad about the waterfall. But
okay,
you
gotcha.
can still tell there is something still that we should reverence, or that we should still say, you know, yeah, wow, there's something about this.
Okay.
I don't know exactly where he says it because my book isn't the same as your pages, but he calls in a point of judgment that we are called, because we call sublime okay and pretty not okay. We call ourselves to make a judgment, and the judgment is not based on the waterfall. The judgment is based on our subjective thinking about the waterfall, that one's right and the other one's wrong. So that, I mean, that's just part of this whole theory based on that part in the middle between emotion and reason that is missing in this book.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think C.S. Lewis is going to say that, kind of like we talked about in our first discussion from his essay, The Poison of Subjectivism, that there are two dimensions. There's an objective dimension and a subjective dimension, and they both are important, and they both relate to each other. And so Coleridge at the waterfall, one tourist thought it was sublime, one thought it was pretty. They both, I mean, there is something about the waterfall that we can say that both of them are right in an objective way. There is something about the waterfall that creates some type of emotion like that. But yeah, you may have one person who thinks that one waterfall is much more sublime, where another person may say, well, yeah, I've seen a lot of waterfalls in the world. This one is only nice or only pretty. But they both could agree there is something grand about this and majestic about this. And so C.S. Lewis is going to say that it's not that there is no room for subjectivity, but we just can't discount the objective element. There should still be a proper response. So if someone walked up to the waterfall and was like, yeah, this is ugly, or this is boring, or I could care less, that there's something within them where their emotions have not been cultivated very well to see that there is something objective about this waterfall that merits an emotion from us. And like you had said, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, that we wouldn't necessarily have sad emotions if something bad had happened. But there is still recognizing there is something objective here about this waterfall. And it's not me just simply expressing my feelings. Now, if I walked up to the waterfall and said, yeah, I feel really sad about the waterfall, then that's recognizing that there is a subjective response within me because of past experiences. And that expression would be subjective, but we could still step back from that and still recognize the objective element. And I think as he goes on, he'll draw it out more, I think. But I think, again, it's like with horses. There may be people who have had a bad experience with horses, who become fearful of horses. But we should still recognize that there's something about horses that merits our value and our respect. We should not be abusing animals. We should not be starving them. We should not be beating them violently and injuring them intentionally, because that horse, even if we've had a bad experience, even if we're afraid of them because we've fallen off, that horse still, there is something objective about that horse that merits a proper response, which is at minimum a respect for the animal, that we should still value and respect that animal. And that's the objective element, but that we could have some subjective responses as well because of our past experiences, our life experiences, and things like that. And I think where he's going with this and why this is so important is because if we eliminate the objective element to these things, and that everything is only subjective, then if we look at the world around us in the way the Green Book is trying to teach people to do, is to say, oh, all your emotions should be discounted as merely subjective, there's nothing objective, then if we look at the world around us, and let's say we see someone like this, if we think there is nothing objective here, everything's subjective, then people could have any response they wanted to this man. It'd be okay for someone to hate him or be vicious to him or be disrespectful to him because it's all subjective, right? I mean, what C.S. Lewis is going to say is no, there is something objective here. There should be an emotion. There's an objective dimension to encountering this man that we should have. Now, there may be a subjective element as well, because of our experiences and values and preferences, but there's something objective here. There are going to be certain things that are objectively right and objectively wrong in how we should respond to this man. Similarly, if we saw a child being bullied at school, if we teach our children that everything's subjective, anytime we say that there's some, like if we said that the waterfall's sublime or that person is contemptible, then it'd be almost saying like, oh, this child is being verbally abused, then they would almost say, well, that's just your personal preference. That's just your subjective feeling. C.S. Lewis is going to say, how can we say that everything's subjective and be able to approach the world in a rightly ordered way? Because we should approach a bullied child or child being abused with compassion, with respect, with trying to help that child in that situation rather than become one of the people who are bullying him. And then similarly, if everything was subjective, then virtues like justice and docility and sacrifice, if everything was subjective, then people could say, oh yeah, these are awful. We should never do these. That's my personal preference. If your personal preference is that justice is a good thing, well, then that's your personal preference. And same thing with some of the vices like betrayal and cowardice and dishonesty. If everything is simply subjective, then the Green Book authors would have to, in order to be consistent with their argument that everything's subjective, they would have to say that it's okay for someone to say, and this should be injustice actually, but they'd be saying that dishonesty is okay. That's your personal preference. If you think dishonesty is okay, or if you think betrayal and cowardice are virtues, well, that's fine because that's your subjective opinion. And so he's going to kind of suggests to us that if there is no objective dimension to the world and to reality, then how can we have virtue and vice? How can we have any objective truth when it comes to our viewing of the world, our approach to the world, if everything's subjective? So kind of moving forward, C.S. Lewis says that the authors of the Green Book seem to think that its readers are susceptible to emotional propaganda, and it seems they're trying to eliminate all emotion, all sentiment, or at least they're calling attention to their view that emotions are merely subjective and not objective. And C.S. Lewis is going to emphasize that efforts should be made not to eliminate emotion, but to instill sentiments that are reasonable and that are just, sentiments that are rightly ordered to the objective truth present in the situation. And C.S. Lewis would say, yes, our emotions could be corrupted. We could be misled. We could respond incorrectly to a situation or unreasonably. And yes, C.S. Lewis is going to object to what's called emotivism, which is similar to subjectivism, basically, that we only know truth through our emotions. He's like, yeah, emotions are not the only thing that are important here. And he's going to argue emotions are not necessarily unreasonable or irrational, though, which is almost what the Green Book authors are trying to make its readers think, is that emotions are they're not reasonable or rational. They're just simply subjective. You should dismiss them. And so C.S. Lewis is going to hold the issue is more often that our emotions are unrefined. He uses the word vulgar. Our emotions are more, the issue is that they're vulgar. It's not that the people have an excess of emotions. So he's saying they're unrefined. They're not trained properly. They're not rightly ordered. And he says the task, this is the popular quote that a lot of people use and that we talked about in our discussion questions. C.S. Lewis says the task is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. So he's saying that the authors seem to think there's too much emotion out there. We need to get rid of it all. And C.S. Lewis is saying, I don't think the problem is that there's too much emotion. I think that the problem is that people are actually cynical and they lack the appropriate emotion. That too often people are just really kind of complacent or indifferent, or things are not cultivated properly. And then he's going to say, if our emotions are not governed by reason, that's when people will be prey to propaganda. And this is one of the problems. But then he says our emotions and our reason need to be in accord with each other, but they also need to be in accord with objective truth. There's this supplemental reading I sent out yesterday that has a really good quote about what C.S. Lewis means here when he says that our task is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. It's a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's really good and spot on for what C.S. Lewis is trying to say. So I'm going to read it. They say, what Lewis is saying is that young people have a propensity towards apathy or cynicism or sterile complacency anyway. And if you only magnify this cynicism by telling them that all value and emotion is subjective and that absolute truths do not exist, then you create a thirsty vacuum that is actually more vulnerable to being filled by advertising and propaganda. Being subjected to the endless debunking of ideals imparts young people a smug pleasure in their own knowingness that can disguise an ignorance that leaves them susceptible to the enticements of disinformation. Really protecting one's mind from indoctrination requires filling it with positive truths that are both well-reasoned and animated by sentiment. A man with a well-honed sentiment for an ideal, a real love for something, rises above the cheap plays of propaganda. Emotional sentiment not only functions as a defense against negative propaganda, but acts as a catalyst for offensive activity. As Lewis argues, dry rationality alone can never be a sufficient spur to positive action. We'll talk more about that. But essentially saying that Lewis thinks that people really are apathetic and cynical and complacent. So if you tell them, yeah, get rid of all the emotion, every emotion is subjective, then they're going to have this vacuum that is very vulnerable to being filled by propaganda, because we are emotional creatures. Emotion is part of who we are. And so what we need to do is rightly order emotion, not tell people just to discount it. because emotion is important, sentiment is important. It's part of our life as being human beings, but let's help to make sure that our emotions are rightly ordered to reason and to objective truth. And then that way we can help protect people from propaganda and indoctrination, not just getting rid of all emotion, which the Green Book seems to be doing. And so if we do that, that's what C.S. Lewis feels like will help people to protect themselves from propaganda. Okay, questions or comments so far?
Yeah, well, I think that we've emphasized the subjective, but somewhere along the line during this, what you've done, Allison, is and not as much emphasis on the fact that these men are then going to reason as being the all. In other words, we can't believe our subjective thinking all the time, but we have our reason, and we can reason everything. And in knowing that, we'll know everything. And we don't have to have a true value system because we'll know it. We'll know everything there is to know without a value system. And that's also, that's what he calls the lack of chest. Reason is on top, subject emotion is on the bottom, and you have to have the middle to use both properly. You have to use reason and you have to use your emotion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's going to build up to that. He's going right now. He's trying to help people.
Well, I'm still in chapter 1.
Yeah, this is chapter 1. No, yeah, this is the beginning of chapter 1 still. Yeah.
But anyway, because we're running out of time, my favorite quote in chapter 1 that nobody seems to like as much as I did is that he said, "I'd sooner play cards against a man who has doubts about being ethical. But when he was a child, he was taught that a gentleman doesn't cheat."
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that, to me, it summed up his argument about training a child, and that's what this book that he's discussing is all about, training a child with good, essential moral values will override any of the apathetic current ideas of the time. So a man who doesn't think ethics is important, but was taught as a child that people do not cheat, is a better man to know than somebody who tries to reason it out, or who thinks whatever I feel about it is okay. If I feel like cheating, it's okay. If I don't feel like cheating, it's okay.
Yeah,
good
exactly.
Point.
Yeah,
good point.
Yeah, he's definitely gonna build on this. That right now he's saying that these Green Book authors are rejecting anything objective. They're saying that it's everything subjective. And then that he's concerned that they're dismissing everything objective. So then one of the next quotes that Lewis says in chapter 1, around page 14 in my book, he says, "Until quite modern times, all believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could either be congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. And so certain emotions could be just or ordinate or appropriate, and there's others that are not." And so Lewis is going to demonstrate this using Augustine, Aristotle, Plato, and others, showing how throughout the centuries, people have recognized that there are certain emotions that are appropriate and rightly ordered for certain objective situations because of how the world is. And there's certain emotions that are inappropriate because of how the world is. And then C.S. Lewis is going to say that cultivating these rightly ordered emotions used to be a goal of education. That used to be one of the points of creating a good character and creating virtue, was also not only to let people know there is objective truth, but also how to cultivate emotions so that they were in line with these objective truths. And so he said that in the past, we would educate students so they would have a distaste for things that were ugly, and they would praise things that were beautiful. And he says, by doing this, we would create men who have a gentle heart. And this was really important for an important goal of education. And this Green Book now makes it seem like we're moving away from that and simply telling people to discount objective truth and then just to view any values or emotions as merely subjective. Now, Michael Ward, who wrote that book After Humanity that I referred to in our first talk, he said, C.S. Lewis in this chapter is not claiming there's no role for subjectivism. He is not asserting that we must always separate facts from values. There are objective realities, but we can accommodate our sensibility in the light of what we experience. Our own perspectives matter and are uniquely valuable, but they must be rightly ordered. Recognizing this, we must also try to better understand other people's perspective so that we can supplement our own. So it's, again, like we talked about in our first discussion group, it's not just the objective dimension and it's not just the subjective dimension, it's both. There is an objective dimension, and our subjective experiences are very important to how we view the world and view the objective truths. Our perspectives are valuable, but they must be rightly ordered to truth. And then we must also recognize other people have perspectives as well. They have different life experiences, and so this can affect how they view the same objective thing that we're viewing as well. And so we have to understand there's both elements at play. And so the subjective dimension exists and it's valuable, but it cannot be acknowledged to the exclusion of the objective dimension of reality. And Michael Ward also says that C.S. Lewis is aware of the dangers of trusting misleading emotions, and he's concerned about emotionally manipulative propaganda. But rather than attempting to avoid such dangers by distrusting all emotion, Lewis challenges educators to learn how to cultivate character traits that dispose us to have virtuous emotion, what C.S. Lewis calls just sentiments that reliably represent the objective values of the world. And so C.S. Lewis will show that people from ancient times, from various religious backgrounds, all held that there were some objective truth. You know, there were some things that were true and good and beautiful, and we should conform to these things. Now, on some levels, we may disagree on some of this, but there are some foundational things that across human history that people would agree are true and good and beautiful. And different cultures give this objective reality different names. And so Lewis is going to hone in on the Chinese term, the Tao, or he says that it's also could be referred to as the way. And throughout this book, he's going to use the term the Tao to refer to this objective truth, the objective dimension of reality. His using the Tao doesn't suggest that Lewis says that Chinese philosophy is the fullness of truth. C.S. Lewis uses this term, the Tao, to talk about objective truth, objective morality, the natural law. But instead of using those terms, he uses the Tao because C.S. Lewis was a well-known Christian convert at this point in time, and he wants to make an argument against subjectivism to show that his arguments are universal. It's not merely a Christian argument, that his arguments against subjectivism are held by people of all religious backgrounds, that there is this argument for subjective truth that's held universally. So he's going to use the term Tao to emphasize that. And then because of the kind of universe that we live in, because of the kind of creatures that we are, there are things objectively true and things that are false. And so, yes, emotions can be in or out of harmony with our reason. Emotion alone cannot be the only judge about what is true, but emotions can be reasonable or unreasonable. But then at the same time, our reason is not the only thing we look at either. We can't just decide things on reason alone. Our reason must be grounded in the Tao. Our reason must be grounded in this objective universal truth that exists, this objective morality that exists. So we have emotion, reason, and the Tao that all must be working together. And so Lewis will draw attention to the fact that Green Book excludes the possibility that emotions can be reasonable or unreasonable. The Green Book excludes the possibility that emotions can be rightly ordered or disordered, and excludes the objective. It just simply says emotion is always subjective merely. It's merely personal preference, personal opinion. And so when you look at the world, everything is just subjective. And so Lewis holds that this is a big problem. And so he views, towards the end of this chapter, he says there's two ways that you can approach the world in his mind. He says you can either have a worldview grounded in the Tao, or you have a worldview that's outside of the Tao. And that's it. You're going to exist in one of these worldviews. If you're grounded in the Tao, then what we need to do is train students so that our emotions and reason are guided by in accord with objective truth. If you see the world as having objective truth, then we need to train our reason and our emotions to be in accord with it. But if you have a worldview where you live outside of the Tao, you deny the Tao, then if you're a logical person, then the ultimate conclusion you have to make is that all emotion is equally non-rational. Everything is subjective. No emotion correlates with reality or not. It can be whatever you want it to be. And he says, so if you are of this mentality, like the Green Book authors seem to be, then either you're going to have to either eliminate all emotion, because how are we going to even have a conversation or debates or talk about the world if I think something is beautiful and someone thinks it's ugly, or if I think something is good and someone thinks something's bad? How are we going to have any conversation about that? So your goal, if you think there is no objective grounding, you must just eliminate all emotion. Or your goal must be, I'm going to encourage emotion, but the only way we can create order in this world is that you have conditioners and the conditioned. You have a group of people who are going to try condition people to believe certain emotions are appropriate, whereas others are inappropriate. Otherwise, how are we going to have anything but anarchy or tyranny in this world? Nothing but chaos will exist if all we do is let people be truly subjective. And he's going to expand on this in the next few chapters, is that if you're outside of the Tao and you're a logical person, then anything goes. Any emotion can be appropriate or inappropriate based on your own personal preference. Then how do we even exist in this world together? And the answer is that we must have conditioners and the conditioned. We must have people doing propaganda, people teaching people what's appropriate or not, because that's their opinion. And so he's going to say people are going to be left prone to propaganda that manipulates our emotions if we are not grounded in objective truth. And this is what C.S. Lewis fears is going to happen if the authors of the Green Book are successful in teaching people that everything is simply subjective. And then he's going to say that another problem with this idea about subjectivity is that there's no justification of virtue will enable a man to be virtuous. So I can't just say, oh, sacrifice is good. Me trying to say, oh, that soldier sacrificed for the country and now he has a Medal of Honor, that's a good thing. He's trying to justify the virtue of self-sacrifice. That's not going to make a man virtuous. We have to train emotions to be in accord with objective truth and to be in accord with virtue. Otherwise, we're not going to have people see the power of being virtuous or the benefit of being virtuous. I'm going to skip this just for time's sake. But C.S. Lewis is going to say, but there is more than reason and emotion. And this is kind of what Betty was getting to earlier. He says there's an analogy of a body. We have a head, the stomach, and the chest. The head is our reason and our intellect. the stomach or the belly are the emotions, and then the chest is the Tao. And Lewis is going to say that the head rules the belly through the chest. The chest is the seat of magnanimity. With the great magnanimity means the greatness of soul. And so the chest is really the seat of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiment. So our reason guides our emotion, but we have to have that chest. We have to have that objective truth there, or reason and emotion are going to be completely into chaos. And he's going to say, if we create men without chest, without this Tao, what's the result? Either you're going to be ruled by pure reason, which is erroneous because our intellect can make mistakes. We can think, we can try to reason and make mistakes about something. Plus, Lewis is going to essentially say that, pure rationalism can lead to materialism and scientism and errors of worldviews such as these, which are problematic. But so we're either going to be ruled by our head, our intellect, or we're going to be ruled by our emotions. And this is going to result in subjectivism. But subjectivism often leads to skepticism. And so that's problematic. And so he says, if we don't have a chest, then we have a problem, because neither pure rationalism or pure subjectivism, neither one is grounded in any type of truth. And so without chest, the result is disorder and ultimately anarchy and tyranny, regardless of which emphasis you have. If you emphasize the reason or emphasize emotion, the result is the same: disorder, anarchy, or tyranny. But he says this notion of subjectivism, what we're doing, what the Green Book authors are doing, is creating men without chests. And so he says there's another problem. We're creating men without chests, but what are we doing in this world? We continue to clamor for those qualities which are rendering impossible. We want people who are driven, who are responsible, who are generous, who are courageous, who are selfless, who are honest. I mean, if you go talk to any employer, what type of employee are they looking for? If you go talk to a spouse, or a man or woman seeking a spouse, what type of spouse are they looking for? Or a friend, or a politician. We want people who are honest, selfless, courageous, generous, driven. We want people that way. But if you remove the chest, the organ that really makes these things possible, then you're rendering this desire impossible. Because if there's no objective truth, why should I be selfless? Why not live however I want if there is no truth? Why not do whatever I feel like doing? Why should I be honest? Why should I be honorable if there's no objective truth? If I want to have more power and more wealth, why not cheat and lie and steal and do whatever I have to reach my goal of being more powerful or to be more rich? Why not do whatever it takes to achieve whatever goal that I think is important? So if we say that everything is subjective, how can we then at the same time tell people that we think it is virtuous to be honest and honorable? And so C.S. Lewis, at the end of chapter 1, this really famous quote, he says, "We make men without chests, and we expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor, but we're shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful." So you're saying, we are creating men without chest because we're rejecting that there's anything objective. We're rejecting the notion of objective truth, but yet we want them to be virtuous. How can we expect that when we're telling them there is no objective morality? There is no objective truth. The Green Book authors promote subjectivism, so they're going to laugh at someone saying that being honorable is good. They say, oh, that's your personal preference, that honor is a good thing. And then he says, you say that honor is a subjective good, and then you get upset when you have a traitor. And so he's saying, we castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. So we're having these geldings, these horses, and we're castrating them. But then we're saying, oh yeah, go be fruitful. We're asking the impossible of the world we're creating. And so that's how he kind of ends this chapter, by trying to draw attention to the problems he sees with subjectivism. And so then he's going to go into chapter 2, where he's going to continue to expand on this and continue to show why subjectivism is a problem. He's going to start to argue against it further. And then as the book goes on, he'll start to show more and more of the problems of subjectivism. And he's going to continue to emphasize that we need men with chests. We need our reason and our emotions to be rightly ordered to the Tao, to objective truth, to objective morality, to the natural law. And that's where he's going to go from here. All right, so I'll stop there. Questions, comments?
Well, it's getting late.
It is. It is.
Yeah, and I think that should give it a good pathway for people who are frustrated by the fact that his vocabulary is probably a great deal better than ours. And so because this was a real lecture, and I don't know who the audience was, it's a little daunting, and it's good to try to explain it in simpler ways. But it's not a simple concept. And I hope we'll continue to do this. And Allison, the next time, I'm not on Facebook all the time. So the next time we have a Zoom meeting, would you please remind me and give me the numbers? Because I think, do you have the same numbers each time?
No, they're different. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, okay. So I'm using the time to talk to you personally. I don't.
That's okay. That's okay.
Thanks a lot, Allison, for helping understand it.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. I think that it is hard to try to compress chapter 1 into a language that everybody can feel comfortable with, because it's a difficult concept. But you're doing a good job. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. All right.
All right. Thank you. All right. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hold on.